Paul, thanks for that presentation. I had to stop scribbling furiously because it was going to throw me off course on my presentation. There are some extraordinary continuities between Australia and New Zealand that you mentioned. What I want to do is walk you through where I think immigration policy in Australia fits in terms of our open economic model. And I view the immigration program the way it's functioning now, with the emphasis on skill, not just emphasis on skill, but the try before you buy aspect of it. Most of the recruiting we now do is onshore. So a bit over half the permanent settlers in Australia changed categories. So they were temporary migrants before they settled, and that's occurred in the last couple of years. Now I view the way the program has evolved, and it's sort of evolved out of sight of the public, and I think a lot of politicians are not that clued up on what it means themselves. I've given a couple of presentations now internally to the public service in Australia on precisely this topic, that I don't think people understand how profound the changes we've had over the last 15 years in particular are. Now, one way to think about the migration program today is that it's become the fifth pillar of the open model. Now, the open model, as you've heard Bob Hawke, Paul Keating and John Howard tell you ad infinitum, and we went one more time around the world for sport in a television documentary a couple of years ago for the ABC. It was essentially a process by which four of the main prices in the economy were taken off the cabinet table and handed over to the market. The floating of the dollar, the setting of interest rates independently of government by the Reserve Bank, wages set at the enterprise level, and of course through the removal of the tariff wall, the absence of any government control over import prices or the quantity of imports. I would add migration as the fifth pillar for the following reasons. The government today does not have the control over the migration problem that it once did. And that is because it's demand driven and most of it is set by the market. So the numbers that come in, the government can control the flow, but the actual numbers that come into Australia in any given year is actually determined by the market and by education institutions. And the numbers themselves are quite profound. The only way to really get your head around it is to understand that we're adding an extra 1 million people a decade because of overseas migration. In each decade after the Second World War, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s and the 90s, population grew by about 2 million a decade. So rate of growth is actually declining because the number is pretty static. And a bit over half that population growth for each decade after the Second World War was net natural increase. Now, for the last 3 decades of the last 2 decades of the 20th century, I'll give you the net overseas migration figure. I'll annualise it for you just to make it a bit easier. It was a bit over 100,000 in the 80s, and it was around 80,000 in the 90s. Of course, there's an interruption of a very, very deep recession in the early part of the 90s there. The first decade alone of the 21st century, and you should be aware of this headline number, but understand what this thing means. Population didn't grow by 2 million a decade, it grew by 3 million a decade. Now that extra million has come from overseas. Whereas in the previous decade, the 1990s, net overseas migration of about 80,000 a year. We got 180,000 a year in the first decade alone of the 21st century. Now, take the annual rate now, based on the data for the last 4 years, it's a bit over 200,000 a year. That is the big profound shift. And the reason, as I said, if you look at it as the fifth pillar and it's demand driven, growing uninterrupted for 25 years is one of the reasons why you'd be adding this many migrants. But the other reason we're adding this many migrants is that the Chinese and Indians are choosing us. And the Chinese and Indians are emigrating at a rate that has no comparison in human history outside of the 19th century. And think about what the Chinese and Indians are doing. These are two rising nations, but their middle class is emigrating for the same reasons roughly that the British were emigrating in the 19th century. The middle class is moving because they're leaving a political system that's not quite ideal for them, an environment that's degraded, cities that are overcrowded. They're actually moving for opportunity. And even though notionally we're recruiting them, it's their choice to come here that is actually driving a lot of the policy challenges, I think, in the next few years for people. Now that's just the headline figure. Now the detail. Today in Australia, there are a little over 1 million people born in either China or India. For the first time on record, that 1 million from the two biggest countries on earth outnumber the British in Australia. So that's a big stat. Now the median age for an English-born Australian is about 54, 55. The median age for a Chinese or Indian-born Australian is in the mid-30s. It's a bit lower for the Indian, it's a bit higher for the Chinese. So half your English-born population in Australia is essentially retirees. More than half your Chinese and Indian-born population in Australia are in the process of becoming your new middle or even your elites. Now this is the other part of the migration program I think very few politicians have got their heads around. Most of the migrants that arrive today don't come to Australia via the same route that pretty much we are familiar with. Story of my parents, story of pretty much, I'd imagine, a lot of people in this room. The post-war migration program begins with a low-skilled worker, and you measure the success of the program in two ways. The fact that the low-skilled migrant took a job, was able to acquire property, but critically, through their kids, their Australian-born kids, they overachieved. And we know that the kids of non-English-speaking immigrants outperform all others in their peer group. And that's a pretty stable statistic. It's not just an Australian story, it's actually a story you see played out around the world. Most of the migrants who have been arriving in the last 15 years don't start at the bottom and get to the top via their kids, they start at the top. Bob Gregory's made this point most recently, and if you haven't seen the slide presentation he gave to the Australian Melbourne Institute Prosperity and Opportunity Conference late last year, dig it out, because there's a particular statistic in there which it's quite mind-blowing if you think it through. The net addition of jobs in Australia, the net addition of full-time jobs in Australia since 2007, almost every one of those jobs has been taken by an overseas-born person. Now, think about what that means. There's obviously a bit of it doesn't mean that the migrant has taken the job of a local born. When I wrote a version of the story earlier for The Australian, we had this rotten headline on the front page that said, migrants take Aussie jobs. And I insisted on a correction the next day. Now, Bob's updated the data, and Bob's actually done a terrific job on this. Within the local born population, what's actually happening is that new entrants to the labour market are essentially replacing the retirees. So the net addition of the jobs are gone to the overseas born. Now, in any economy where you're sourcing your skill globally, you'd think, in a macro sense, the economy is thriving. But at the local level, and we'll probably deal with this a bit more in the question and answer, I don't want to flag too many thoughts here. There's a couple of issues to think through. So even though, as I say, it's the fifth pillar of the open model, I think it requires a more active government to deal with flows of people this grand. One of the reasons is, if your overseas born is landing on the top, the social hierarchy, you've got a big question to ask yourself about what you do with the rest of the population. The other thing is, and this is a story now that the Treasury are taking forever to get their heads around, and traditionally they don't want to get into the planning business, they don't want to get into the city's agenda. But if you think about what our cities are starting to look like now, and given that the population has been moving a lot quicker in the last 10 to 15 years than I think any government previously has had to cope with, we're now about to reach a tipping point in Sydney if we haven't already got there, and we're certainly reaching it soon in Melbourne, where this concept of livability that we have a couple of million. Now, I'm going to read you a line from The Economist, and it puts it in their report every year, and this is why we need to think about these things as public policy makers. Those that score best tend to be mid-sized cities in wealthier countries with relatively low population density. This can foster a range of recreational activities without leading to high crime levels or overburdened infrastructure. Now, I know internally most of the evidence at a state government level is when a city crosses about 5 million, 4 to 5 million. That's about the number, isn't it? Where you start to struggle to keep the city functioning. Now, I know in Sydney, of course, in fact, Mike Baird is trying to do something that Arthur Phillip tried in 1789. He's trying to move the centre of Sydney to Parramatta. It's ever been thus in Sydney that Sydney Cove was the wrong place to locate the centre. Now, the issue of population density, the issue of livability, the infrastructure story, doesn't actually affect the new arrival. Because remember where the new arrival is ending up. The new arrival is ending up in the inner city. The new arrival is ending up on the top of the pile, on the top of your social structure. So somebody leaving Mumbai or Beijing, the year-to-year loss in livability in a Melbourne or Sydney is not going to matter to them because their frame of reference is the mother country. Now, when I say there are implications for government, when I say that you need a more active government, this extra million people that we received in the last decade, and Ken Henry's made this point publicly much better than I would, the political system couldn't handle that extra million. Literally couldn't handle it. I quote often the case study in Victoria where the Bracks government at the turn of the 21st century thought Melbourne was about to resume its title as the world's most livable city, knew the population was coming, and guess what? Didn't build a public transport network to cater for it. And the problem that they've got now is that once you let something as simple, as basic as your public transport infrastructure fall behind population growth, it takes many years to catch it up. Now, at a political level, I can tell you the volatility in Victoria is all sourced to public transport. So we've had a one-term government on the coalition side. We had a Labor government that expected to win, got knocked off in 2010. Coalition gets rolled in 2014, and we've got a Labor government now running against the clock to try and deal with its public transport issue before the next election. When we look a lot further north, we see political volatility that is inside. London voted to remain in the EU. The City of London did, but most of the rest of England population is driven by migration. The only other time in Australian history that that happened was the 1850s. It's the only other time in Australian history that more than half the population growth over a consistent period, now it's about 10 years now, came from overseas was the 1850s, and that was the gold rush. Now in Sydney and Melbourne, of course, and even in Perth, 2 minutes, thanks. In Sydney and Melbourne, and even in Perth, the overseas born are pushing 40% already. Now these are cities of many millions of people. The last time we had an overseas born population of that order in the colonies was the 1870s. And these are colonies, New South Wales and Victoria hadn't even reached 1 million each at this point. So we're running quite a challenging experiment in mass high-income diversity, but it does have implications for everybody else. Now, I'm just going to leave it at that because I know we flagged some questions in our discussions, and I know there's a collective intelligence in the room will outweigh anything that I might be able to add from this point on, so I'm also looking forward to the exchange. Thank you.